You may have noticed something lately that doesn't quite make sense. You wake up and before the day has even begun, your body already feels heavy. Not exhausted in the ordinary sense, not sleep deprived, not burned out in a way you can easily explain, just heavy. A quiet resistance settles in your chest. Your limbs feel slow. The idea of getting up, of entering the noise of the world, feels strangely wrong. And almost immediately another voice appears, the judging voice. You're lazy, you're weak, you're losing discipline. Other people can push through this. Why can't you? So you try to force yourself up. You scroll, you stimulate, you shame yourself into movement. But the heaviness doesn't disappear. It waits. Carl Jung would say this is not an accident. He would say that when the body refuses to rise, something far older than your habits is speaking, because the psyche does not collapse randomly. It withdraws deliberately. We live in a culture that treats constant motion as virtue, a culture that equates worth with output, a culture that mistrusts stillness and calls rest a failure unless it has been earned. But the psyche does not answer to culture. It answers to truth. And when your outer life drifts too far from your inner reality, the psyche intervenes. Not dramatically, not violently, quietly, through fatigue, through resistance, through the desire to lie down and disappear from the demands of the world. What you call laziness, Jung would call a signal that something inside you has stopped cooperating with the life you are living. This is where most people go wrong. They assume the problem is lack of motivation, lack of discipline, lack of willpower, so they attack themselves. They push harder, they override sensation, they drown out the message with stimulation and productivity, and in doing so, they silence the very intelligence that is trying to protect them. Jung believed the body is not separate from the soul. It is one of its primary instruments. The unconscious does not speak in words. It speaks in sensations, in impulses, in sudden exhaustion, in an unexplainable refusal to continue. And when the body grows heavy for no clear external reason, it is rarely because you are failing. It is because continuing as you are would require betraying something essential. The psyche does not rebel without cause. It rebels when your life has become dishonest. Dishonest not in the moral sense, but in the existential one. When you are living from obligation rather than alignment, from expectation rather than truth, from survival rather than meaning. The body senses this long before the conscious mind is willing to admit it, so it pulls the brakes. And that is why this tiredness feels different. It does not respond to rest alone. It does not disappear after sleep. It does not lift when you get going, because it is not physical fatigue. It is psychic withdrawal. Jung described this as a retraction of libido, not sexual energy, but life energy itself. The soul withdraws its investment from the outer world, not because it wants you to suffer, but because it wants you to listen. This is the part that modern culture cannot tolerate. The idea that doing nothing can be meaningful, that stopping can be intelligent, that lying still can be a form of inner work. We have been trained to see stillness as stagnation. Jung saw it as incubation, a phase where the unconscious reorganizes itself beneath awareness. On the surface, you appear unmoving. Internally, entire structures are shifting. Old identities dissolve. Old values lose their grip. Old ambitions fall quiet. And because the ego thrives on identity, this phase feels frightening. When you are not moving, you are not performing. When you are not performing, you are not reinforced. When you are not reinforced, the question emerges, who am I without my roles? This is why the ego panics in stillness. It labels the experience as laziness, depression, weakness, anything to avoid facing the deeper truth. Because if the ego admits that the heaviness has meaning, it must also admit that something in your life has ended. And endings are destabilizing. Jung believed that every major psychological transformation begins with a descent, a withdrawal from the world, a turning inward. Mythologically, this appears as the hero entering the cave, the desert, the underworld. Psychologically, it appears as fatigue, withdrawal, silence. You do not enter these spaces because you choose to. You enter them because you must, and the body is often the gatekeeper. When the body refuses to rise, it may be because your psyche is preparing to shed an identity that no longer fits, an identity you learned to inhabit to survive, to belong, to be accepted. But survival identities are not meant to be permanent. They are scaffolding, and eventually scaffolding must be dismantled, or it becomes a cage. The problem is that dismantling feels like loss. You lose certainty, you lose structure, you lose momentum, and the ego interprets loss as danger. So it urges motion, it urges distraction, It urges you to override the signal and return to the familiar, even if the familiar is slowly draining the life out of you. This is why the heaviness often appears at moments of transition, not when everything is visibly falling apart, but when something internally has already finished. A role that no longer fits, a path that has reached its end, a version of yourself that has expired. The conscious mind resists this knowledge and it says, nothing has changed. My responsibilities are the same. I should be able to continue. But the unconscious knows better. It knows when a season has ended. And when the conscious mind refuses to listen, the body intervenes. This is not punishment, it is correction. Jung warned that when people ignore these early signals, the psyche escalates. What begins as heaviness becomes chronic exhaustion. What begins as resistance becomes numbness. What begins as stillness becomes collapse. Not because the psyche is cruel, but because it is persistent. It will not allow you to live indefinitely against your own truth. So if you have felt this desire to lie down, to withdraw, to pause in a way that feels deeper than ordinary tiredness, do not rush to eliminate it. Do not immediately label it as something to fix. Because before transformation, there is always a pause. Before renewal, there is always withdrawal. Before a new orientation forms, the old one must loosen its grip. This is the moment most people misunderstand and sabotage. They treat the pause as a problem. Jung treated it as a threshold, a crossing point between who you were and who you are becoming. And thresholds are always uncomfortable because there is no clear map, no external validation, only an inward pull that asks you to slow down enough to hear it. In the next part, we will move deeper into this signal itself. We will explore the different forms this heaviness can take and why not all tiredness asks for the same response. Because some fatigue asks for rest, some ask for grief, some ask for boundaries, some ask for truth, and some ask for change. Until you learn to tell them apart, you will keep fighting yourself at the exact moment your psyche is trying to guide you. When Jung spoke about fatigue, he was careful not to treat it as a single phenomenon. He observed that tiredness wears many masks, and when people fail to distinguish between them, they respond incorrectly, resting when they should confront, pushing when they should grieve, numbing when they should listen. That is why the desire to lie down all day can feel so confusing, because not all heaviness means the same thing. Some forms of tiredness are signals of depletion, others are signals of transition, others are signals of misalignment, and some are signals of transformation already underway. Jung believed that when the psyche withdraws energy, it does so with precision. Each withdrawal carries a message. And unless you learn to read that message, you will keep mistaking guidance for weakness. The first form Jung observed is the tiredness of misalignment. This is not dramatic exhaustion. It is subtle, persistent heaviness. You wake up and immediately feel resistance toward the day ahead, not because the tasks are difficult, but because they feel empty. Conversations feel scripted, routines feel hollow, achievements feel distant, as if they belong to someone else. You are functioning, but not participating. Jung believed this tiredness appears when your outer life no longer reflects your inner values, when you are doing what is expected rather than what is true. The psyche begins to withdraw its energy from activities that no longer carry meaning, not as punishment, as honesty. Your soul is saying, I will not fuel what is false. This is why pushing harder does not work. Discipline fails because discipline cannot generate meaning. You can force the body for a while, but the psyche will not cooperate indefinitely. And the more you override this signal, the heavier the tiredness becomes, until you either listen or break. The second form Jung identified is the tiredness of ungrieved loss. This one often confuses people because nothing appears wrong in the present. Your life may look stable, but something inside you feels heavy and old. This heaviness belongs to the past. Losses you were never allowed to mourn, endings you rushed past, versions of yourself that died quietly without acknowledgement. Jung saw unprocessed grief as one of the greatest drains on psychic energy. Grief does not disappear when ignored. It goes underground, and there it absorbs vitality. You feel tired because part of your soul is holding vigil for something that was never properly buried. A relationship that ended without closure, a dream you abandoned to survive, a younger self who had to grow up too fast. This tiredness asks not for rest, but for remembrance, for stillness long enough to feel what you avoided. Because until grief is honored, energy cannot return. The third form is the tiredness of emotional overload. Jung observed that some people are naturally more sensitive to psychological atmosphere. They absorb tension, they register unspoken conflict, They feel the emotional weather of rooms before words are exchanged. These individuals are not weak, they are permeable, and permeability requires recovery. This tiredness appears after prolonged exposure to noise, not auditory noise, but emotional noise. Other people's expectations, other people's moods, other people's unresolved conflicts. The psyche retreats not because it is failing, but because it needs to cleanse. Stillness becomes a form of emotional hygiene. Lying down becomes a boundary the body enforces when the mind refuses to. This tiredness asks for solitude, not stimulation, silence, not motivation. The fourth form Jung described is the tiredness of transition. This one is the most misunderstood and the most important. It appears when an identity dissolves and a new one has not yet formed. You are no longer who you were, but not yet who you will become. Jung called this the liminal state, the in-between. During this phase, the psyche expends enormous energy dismantling old structures. Beliefs unravel, attachments loosen, values reorganize. The conscious mind experiences only fatigue, but beneath awareness, construction is happening. This is the tiredness of metamorphosis. You are not empty. You are reorganizing. And because there is no script for this phase, the ego panics. It wants clarity. It wants direction. It wants to move. But movement before integration creates collapse. So the psyche slows you down, forces pause, demands stillness. This tiredness does not want you to return to your old life. It wants you to wait until the new one has form. The fifth form Jung identified is the tiredness of blocked creativity. This does not refer only to artistic creativity. It refers to life force itself, the impulse to shape, to build, to express, to contribute something uniquely yours. When this energy is suppressed by fear, routine, conformity, or prolonged self-betrayal, it does not disappear. It stagnates, and stagnation feels heavy. This tiredness is not emptiness. It is unused energy turning inward, the soul saying, "Stop wasting what I gave you." This form of fatigue asks not for rest, but for expression, for permission, for a doorway through which life force can move again. All five forms share one truth. The body becomes the messenger when the psyche has exhausted subtler ways of speaking. The heaviness is not the enemy, it is the signal. But here is the mistake most people make. They treat all tiredness the same. They rest when they should reflect. They push when they should pause. They numb when they should grieve. And so the message repeats, becomes louder, more persistent, until the psyche is forced to escalate. Jung believed that the body is often wiser than the conscious mind. Long before you admit something is wrong, the body knows. Long before you accept that a chapter has ended, the body refuses to continue it. This is why the desire to lie down feels irrational. Your responsibilities have not changed. Your schedule looks the same, but your psyche has already moved on, and it will not lend its energy to a life that no longer fits. This creates internal conflict. The ego insists everything is fine. The body refuses to comply, and the tension between them manifests as fatigue. This is not pathology, it is intelligence. The psyche protecting itself from prolonged self-betrayal. When Jung spoke of healing, he did not mean eliminating symptoms. He meant restoring dialogue between the conscious and unconscious. Listening instead of overriding, understanding instead of forcing. The moment you stop fighting the heaviness and begin asking what it wants, something shifts. The fatigue softens, not immediately, but meaning begins to emerge, and meaning restores energy. In the next part, we will move into the most difficult phase of all, the phase where stillness becomes confrontation, where silence strips away distraction, where the unconscious begins to speak in images, memories, and inner dialogue. Because rest alone is not enough. There comes a moment when the psyche asks not just for pause, but for honesty. And that moment changes everything. There comes a point where stillness stops feeling neutral. At first, lying down feels like relief. Then it feels like emptiness. And eventually, it becomes something else entirely. Confrontation. Jung believed that when the outer world goes quiet, the inner world grows loud. And this is the stage most people try to escape. Because silence removes anesthesia. There is no distraction to soften what rises, no noise to blur the images, no urgency to outrun the truth. This is when the unconscious begins to speak in its native language. Not words, images, memories, sensations, sudden emotions without obvious cause. You may lie still and feel a wave of sadness arrive from nowhere. You may remember something you thought you had moved past. You may feel anger without a target. You may feel fear without danger. Jung called this the inner dialogue, the meeting between ego and psyche. Most people never enter this space consciously. They flee it, they scroll, they sedate, they stimulate, because what rises here cannot be controlled. But Jung insisted this stage is not a breakdown. It is the threshold of integration. The unconscious does not surface chaos without purpose. It surfaces what must be acknowledged to move forward. Stillness becomes the container where truth can finally appear. This is why the desire to lie down often comes with strange guilt. The ego senses that something important is happening, and it is terrified of losing control. So it labels the stillness as laziness, failure, weakness. But the psyche knows better. It knows that movement without truth leads nowhere, and silence without courage leads to stagnation. So it waits, patient, relentless, until you stop resisting. Jung taught that when heaviness persists, you must begin active listening, not thinking, listening. He suggested practices that feel simple but are psychologically radical. Sit in silence. No agenda, no goal. Let images arise, not interpretations, images. A closed door, a dark forest, a child alone, a crumbling house, a narrow bridge. These images are not metaphors you invent. They are communications. Symbols emerging from layers of the psyche beyond logic. Jung warned against analyzing them too quickly. Analysis is often a defense. Instead, he suggested dialogue. You ask the image what it wants. You ask the feeling where it comes from. You ask the fatigue what it is protecting. And then you wait, not for answers, for responses. Responses may come as bodily sensations, tightness, warmth, tears, a sudden memory, a knowing without words. This is the psyche responding. This is what most people miss. The unconscious does not shout, it whispers. And only those who slow down can hear it. This is where many people panic, because what emerges often contradicts the life they built. You may realize you are living for approval. You may see that a relationship has already ended internally. You may feel grief for a life you never lived. You may recognize that the person you have been performing as is not who you are. And this recognition hurts, but Jung was clear. Pain here is not harm, it is honesty. And honesty is the gateway to transformation. This is why the desire to lie down often arrives during life transitions. Even when nothing external has changed, the psyche has already sensed the shift, and it is preparing you for a reorientation. But reorientation requires dismantling illusion, and illusion cannot be dismantled in motion, only in stillness. Jung believed that before any major psychological rebirth, there is a descent, a period where energy withdraws, motivation fades, interest dissolves, life feels pause. This is not stagnation. It is descent into the unconscious. Mythology reflects this everywhere. Heroes enter caves, prophets enter deserts, figures disappear into darkness before returning transformed. Jung saw these myths not as stories, but as psychological maps. The body enacts the same pattern. When it pulls you downward, inward, horizontal instead of vertical, it is guiding you into your own descent. The problem is modern culture has no language for descent, only for progress. So when descent arrives, people pathologize it, medicate it, override it, rush it, and in doing so, they interrupt the transformation. Jung warned that unfinished descents lead to fragmentation. You rise too early, return to performance, but something remains unresolved, and the tiredness returns, heavier, more insistent, until you either listen or collapse. This is why rest alone does not resolve this stage. What is required here is courage. The courage to stay with what emerges, to feel without fixing, to witness without judging, to allow the psyche to complete its work. You may discover grief that needs expression, anger that needs acknowledgement, fear that needs context, desire that needs permission. This is not indulgence, it is integration. The psyche cannot carry split-off material indefinitely. It demands wholeness. And wholeness begins when nothing inside you is exiled. Jung believed that when this inner dialogue is honored, something remarkable happens. The heaviness changes texture. It becomes less oppressive, less dense. The fog begins to thin, not because you forced clarity, but because clarity emerged naturally. You start to feel subtle shifts, moments of calm, moments of insight, moments where the body feels lighter for no obvious reason. This is not energy returning yet. This is alignment beginning, the psyche signaling that it has been heard. But there is still one final phase, and this is where most people sabotage the entire process. Because when energy begins to return, the temptation is to rush back into the old life, to resume old rhythms, to prove productivity, to silence doubt by action. Jung warned against this. He said the psyche emerging from transformation is fragile, tender, unprotected. It requires a new structure, not the old one. And if you pour new energy into old containers, the fatigue will return. In the next part, we will move into this final stage, the moment where energy reappears, where movement becomes possible again, and where the real choice begins, because rest can happen accidentally. But integration is a decision, and without that decision, nothing truly changes. When energy begins to return, it does not announce itself loudly. It does not arrive as motivation. It does not come with confidence or certainty. It appears quietly, a subtle willingness to move, a small curiosity about the world again, a gentle sense that something inside has shifted. Jung believed this was the most delicate phase of all, because this is where most people undo the work without realizing it. After prolonged stillness, the ego becomes impatient. It wants results, proof, momentum. It wants to declare the phase over and rush forward. But the psyche does not operate on ego timelines. It does not restore energy to resume the old life. It restores energy to build a new one. And this distinction determines everything. If you return to the same environments, the same expectations, the same internal demands, the same self-negotiation, the fatigue will return. Not because you failed, but because the psyche recognizes repetition as betrayal. Jung described this phase as re-entry, the moment when the transformed inner world meets external reality again. And re-entry must be slow, intentional, honest. This is where people make the mistake of asking, what should I do now? Jung would say the better question is, what can I no longer do? Because after true inner reorganization, certain behaviors become impossible. You may find you cannot tolerate certain conversations. You may notice you cannot push yourself the way you used to. You may feel resistance to environments that once felt normal. This is not weakness. This is refinement. Your psyche has recalibrated, and it will no longer support a life built on misalignment. This is where boundaries stop being optional, not boundaries as rules, boundaries as reality. Your body will now enforce what your mind previously ignored. If you overextend, you will feel it immediately. If you betray your truth, fatigue will return quickly. If you silence yourself again, heaviness will reappear. This is not punishment. This is intelligence. The psyche no longer whispers at this stage. It corrects, firmly. Jung believed this was a sign of maturation. The unconscious no longer negotiates. It expects cooperation. This is where you begin to live in dialogue with yourself. You no longer ask, how much can I tolerate? You ask, what is sustainable? And sustainability becomes the new measure of success. Not speed, not output, not approval, alignment. You may notice that your energy is different now. Less frantic, less explosive, more grounded. This is not a loss. This is integration. The energy you regain after transformation is not adrenaline. It is coherence. It does not drive you to prove. It allows you to choose. Jung believed this is when individuation truly begins to stabilize. When your actions reflect your inner truth without constant effort. When your body and psyche move in the same direction. When stillness and movement are no longer enemies, but phases of the same rhythm. You begin to trust pauses. You no longer panic when energy dips because you understand the cycle. You rest before collapse. You stop before burnout. You listen before resentment builds. This is not passivity. It is self-leadership. And here is the final reframe Jung offered. The desire to lie down all day was never the problem. The problem was the life that required you to stay standing against yourself. The fatigue was not a flaw. It was a refusal to continue a pattern that no longer matched who you were becoming. You were not breaking down. You were withdrawing consent. Consent to overfunction. Consent to perform. Consent to ignore your own truth. And when consent is withdrawn, systems destabilize. That is unavoidable. But from destabilization comes reorganization. And from reorganization comes a life that no longer requires constant resistance. Jung believed that when the psyche is finally aligned, energy flows naturally, not endlessly, not relentlessly, but rhythmically. There will still be tired days. There will still be pauses, but they will no longer feel meaningless. They will feel appropriate. You will no longer ask, what is wrong with me? You will ask, what is my body asking for? And that shift alone changes everything. Because a life lived in conversation with the psyche does not collapse silently. It corrects early, it adapts, it evolves. This is why Jung insisted that healing is not about returning to who you were. It is about becoming who you can sustain being. If you recognize yourself in this experience, if you have felt the heaviness, if you have judged yourself for it, if you have tried to override it, then understand this clearly. Your body was not betraying you. it was protecting you. Your soul was not retreating, it was reorganizing. And the stillness was not empty, it was full of unseen work. The moment you stop fighting that truth, you stop wasting energy on resistance, and energy begins to return on its own, quietly, reliably, in a form that no longer asks you to disappear to survive. So the next time your body asks you to stop, do not rush to label it. Do not drown it in guilt. Do not force productivity as penance. Pause, listen, ask what truth is trying to surface. Because the psyche does not slow you down randomly. It slows you down when the path you are on can no longer carry who you are becoming. And honoring that moment is not laziness, it is wisdom. It is the beginning of a life that no longer requires collapse to stay honest. And once you understand that, rest becomes sacred, movement becomes intentional, and your life begins to move forward without leaving you behind.